Thank you all for waiting to the very end of this day to hear this presentation that I've brought all the way from Australia. I'm aware that I'm going to be talking about 4 novels that I think probably no one in this room will have read. So I'm going to try to give principally context from the groups that I am discussing and the historical events, and then discuss the novels more in terms of their function than their actual content, which I hope will make some considerable sense to you. And really, the topic of this presentation is what is commonly called cultic violence. Those people who are in this room and work on religious studies and the study of new religions will know that there's a lot of awkwardness and uncertainty about the use of the term cult and its adjectival form cultic. So in my presentation, usually there are quote marks around these words. I want people to think always that they're not easy, they're not unproblematic. I would question many of the things that are said about such things, but nevertheless, I'm very pleased actually that my paper followed the presentations on the flat earthers and ufology, because there are a number of similar strands of argumentation that link what I want to say at this point with those presentations. And those strands are mostly to do with things like the 24-hour news cycle, the way in which we're now absolutely saturated by information on YouTube, on websites. And the interesting thing, of course, is that this information is much less stable and much more difficult to get a grip on than if, for example, the sources are far fewer and we have time to test and to experiment with the information that we have been given. And of course, disasters and violence abound in the world. And one of the problems is, of course, that there is a desensitizing effect to getting to experience descriptions of this terrible violence. And I think I first became aware of this in December of 2005. I was in a hotel room in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, watching obsessively the CNN coverage of the Boxing Day tsunami, in which, as probably everyone remembers, more than 300,000 people perished. And news cycle programs are on a kind of loop tape, and you get the same information, but always with maybe a little bit extra detail or one more person interviewed. And it has an immense cumulative effect. The problem is, of course, that when you do it every day, the cumulative effect gets lost. And so I've suggested that maybe this cycle might lessen the impact of powerful incidents and famous figures from the past. I'm sure, again, all of those people in this room who have reached the advanced age, for example, that I have, will know that one of the problems with teaching in undergraduate university classes is, what do you do with first-year students who were born after September 11 even happened and mostly don't remember or aren't interested in the details of what actually did happen, partly because they've never lived in any other reality apart from the post-September 11 reality. And it means that you have a great deal of difficulty projecting, say, to the 1960s and the 1970s, decades that I know intimately from teaching on new religious movements. You have this problem that students have no experience of those decades. In fact, probably their parents were born in them. And their parents, of course, are not interesting. And living in Australia, their parents didn't have anything to do, say, for example, with the massacre at Jonestown or the crimes of the Manson family, which I'm going to talk to you about today. So it's quite difficult to get them interested. So I've picked these 2 examples partly because they've passed, and this is another link with the flat earthers and ufology, powerfully into popular culture. And in fact, there are television programs and films, that is fictional style narrative films, and there is an endless spewing out of documentary footage and chat show hosts interviewing people who are giving their impressions of these particular incidents. So to an extent, these are incidents that I think have stood this test of time. The other reason why it's topical and it's useful to talk about them now is because last year was the 40th anniversary of the Jonestown deaths, and so there was a great flurry of scholarly work about them, and also documentaries and interviews and so on. And this year is the 50th anniversary of the Manson family slayings in the Los Angeles area. So these sorts of events have lasted for some time, and it's useful to think of them as enduring in a popular cultural form, and perhaps also as shaping and moulding the discourse about other kinds of activities that controversial new religious movements or cults have been involved in since. So, why have I decided to work on fiction? Well, actually, my specialist area of research is about fiction too, though it is explicitly about religions that have been deliberately created based on fictions. So I do a lot of work on religions like Jediism, religions based on J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings trilogy. I work a lot on the Church of All Worlds, which was based on a science fiction novel by Robert A. Heinlein called Stranger in a Strange Land. And so this is kind of a slightly sidestep project, and I have done one other published chapter in the same sort of area, looking at an Australian novelist called Carmel Bird, who writes about violent apocalyptic cults. So I'm sort of borrowing the methodology from that study and applying it to these different novels. One of the reasons why I want to talk about these novels is partly because for the 40th anniversary of Jonestown, Rebecca Moore, the book review editor for Nova Religio, asked me to review one of the novels, Laura Elizabeth Woolett's Beautiful Revolutionary, which is about Jonestown, for the journal. And I thought that was quite an interesting idea, that they were showcasing not only academic work, but they were actually showcasing fictional studies and television work on this topic too. And so I've picked up 4 novels, 2 about the Manson family, Zakari Lazar's Sway, which was written in 2008, and Emma Kline's The Girls, which was written in 2016, and got a great deal of publicity. It is, I think, a very important novel. The 2 novels about Jonestown are eclipsed in the sense that neither has become anywhere near so popular or had such good reviews. They are Fred d'Agüiar's Children of Paradise, published in 2014, and Laura Elizabeth Woolett's Beautiful Revolutionary, which I just mentioned, which was only published last year. And of course, one of the problems with fiction is that it doesn't promise people that it's telling you the facts. It promises you this idea that it's like a thought experiment. Will you come along with me? Will you entertain in your mind things that I'm writing about, and we'll see how it goes. But when you write fiction about real events, that capacity for fiction simply to create another world and to ask you to expand your reality by entering into it is somewhat stunted, because there's this need to be close enough at least to the facts, or people get really annoyed with the fictions or reject them outright and say that they are rubbish. But there are other problems with fiction, because fictions about extreme violence tend to romanticize and to exoticize say, for example, charismatic leaders who preach violence and incite their followers to carry it out. And of course, there's already a kind of unnatural sort of fascination about weird cults and cannibalism and suicide and murder and various other sorts of things. And I am quite certain that all of you have spent a deal of time watching various television programs or reading books or newspaper articles about such things, or online, where there's masses of it. So one of the reasons why I've tried to narrow this down a bit is I'm going to talk a bit today about women in both Jonestown and the Manson family, because new religions and gender expectations are kind of an interesting sub-area. And both of these groups that ended in astonishingly horrible acts of violence actually had really prominent women. So Jim Jones, the Jonestown deaths, murder-suicide combo, is more than 900 people. We'll talk about the details in a few minutes. But a woman, Kэрolайн Leyton, who was his mistress of more than 10 years, was actually his second in command, and her sister, Энни Mur, was a nurse, and yet she was, in fact, the last person to die at Jonestown by self-inflicted gunshot wound after she'd killed an awful lot of other people, including children. Manson's followers were almost all women. 3 women are particularly important in the Manson family. They're the 3 that are in the picture: Sьюзан Atkins, Patrисия Кренуинкел, and Leсли Van Hutен, all of whom were actually charged and found guilty of the Tate LaBianca murders. But 3 others who are equally important were the key prosecution witness, Linda Kasabien, who turned over her evidence in return for indemnity; Lynette Fromm, who was nicknamed Squeaky, who later tried to assassinate the US President Gerald Ford and went to prison over that; and Мэри Branner, who was the mother of Manson's son Valentine Michael, incidentally named for the Martian character in Stranger in a Strange Land. So there's another connection with one of my invented religions. And she was kind of the den mother of the whole group of girls, older, closer to Manson's own age. He was about 15 to 20 years older than most of the girls in his group. And interestingly, a woman called Diane Lake, who had actually effectively flown under the radar for years, put out a book called Member of the Family in 2017, looking forward, I think, basically to this 50th anniversary. And she had joined Manson's commune at age 14 and had been participating in mass drug taking and group sex and so on and so forth. And there were quite a lot of other girls as well, an actress called Kitty Lutasinger, another one of Manson's mothers of one of Manson's children, a woman called Sandra Good, etc. So when we think about women and extreme violence, we then have to think about this cult idea and what's a cult and how does a cult work. And I've just given you 2 quotes here, and I'm not going to read them out. There's no real need. Largely, cults don't have to be religious, and that's one of the reasons I've included Manson, because a lot of people would argue that the Manson family wasn't religious. There are reasons for thinking that it was in a certain kind of way. Jonestown, however, was undeniably a religious movement. Cults are generally put as a subset of charismatic groups, i.e. groups that have a leader who is able to sway and attract others. They're often connected to self-help or radical politics. They tend to be communalist, where people live together, but if not, they're not actually communalist. They tend to be what we call high demand, which means, well, you might live in a flat or a house, but you spend just about every evening and most of every day involved with the members of the group. So, you know, your identity is effectively heavily wound up with the group. And the second quote is more controversial because it talks about people in so-called cults being controlled. And we've heard discussion of the brainwashing and deprogramming hypotheses earlier on today. And I would say that I totally buy the argument that brainwashing is a false concept and it doesn't actually work. But that doesn't stop people from using it. And also people who tend to leave so-called cults usually reinforce that idea because they don't want to take personal responsibility for having been involved in something utterly atrocious. So they tend to craft what Stuart Wright calls, it's Jim Richardson calls a captivity narrative. I would have left, but I couldn't because I was being controlled by these people. So let's just check what happened in Guyana. It happened on the 18th November 1978. I was 16, I can remember it well. The so-called cult problem of the Western world appeared on everybody's television because a US congressman who went to investigate the religious movement called People's Temple was actually shot dead at the Jungle Airport, the closest place for his plane to land to go and visit Jim Jones. Jones had founded People's Temple in 1953, so in fact it was 25 years old in 1978. He was an ordained minister in a denomination called the Disciples of Christ. A few hours after Congressman Ryan died, over 900 of Jones's followers and Jones himself were dead. Babies and small children they had syringes of cyanide poured down their throat. Then older children were made to drink what was called Kool-Aid. In fact, it wasn't Kool-Aid, it was a cheaper version, but you probably know the phrase, drink the Kool-Aid, has made it into pop culture now. It means basically to have swallowed ridiculous things that you should have been able to see that you shouldn't have done, but you were in the grip of the moment. Then the adults drank the Kool-Aid. The Kool-Aid had cyanide in it. This was a suicide ritual, though it's obvious that some people didn't want to do it at the end, and they tried to run away into the jungle, and they were all gunned down by the armed guards who were around the group committing suicide. Eileen Barker's comment here is really important because nearly 300 of the victims, so 1/3, had not reached the age of 17 yet. So they were very, very young and they lost their lives tragically. Another 200, so 500 out of the 900, were over 65. So there wasn't such a great number of people in the middle. There were these extremes. So, what about Jones himself? Well, initially he started off as a good guy. He was anti-racism, an integrationist, he was a civil rights activist, he practiced faith healing, but he got increasingly paranoid. He got very into sex with his church members. In fact, of both sexes, he used it as a method of control. And he was really infected by Cold War ideology, and he became absolutely certain that the end of the world was happening and that there was going to be a nuclear war. And he wanted to move the church to California because he'd heard that one area of California was likely to be spared nuclear fallout. This is another one of those lunatic things that everybody knows isn't actually true, but he believed it anyway. By the time you get to the mid-70s, the church is quite large. It has somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 members, and about 60% of the congregation are African American. In fact, he got lots of awards. Only 1 year prior to the Jonestown massacre and suicides, he got a Martin Luther King Jr. Humanitarian Award for his work for black activism, essentially. And of course, as Sean McLeod says in that quote, nobody thought People's Temple was dangerous or a threat at the time of the actual violent outbreak. So what about the women? There's only been one really detailed study of the women in People's Temple by Mary McCormick Marga, and she says in most new religious movements, women are completely invisible for 3 reasons. Because they're deemed to be brainwashed, they're deemed to be sexually exploited, and in the case of Jonestown, they're victims, extreme victims, because they actually killed themselves. But she argues that's not true for People's Temple, that actually when they moved to Guyana, Jones was getting old and he was increasingly drug dependent and crazy, actually. And the power group, the leadership group of the movement, was all women. And this is principally Kэрolyn Leyton and her sister Энни Mur, but also Jones's own wife Marceline, who was quite important for the group. In fact, she had a similar role as that of Мэри Branner in the Manson family as a kind of mother of the whole community. I just think so. Let's think about Manson as a leader, because I've suggested Jones started out kind of mainstream and went mad, largely. Well, mad actually is the wrong word. I do not wish you to think that I think there's a mental health defense in either of these men's cases. I don't. I think that their worldview spun out of control, and there were certain reasons for that, largely the immense power that their followers kind of gave to them, and also the amount of drugs and various other sorts of things that they both took. They were great ingesters of drugs, both Manson and Jones. So Manson is often not seen as religious, but he did claim he was Christ quite often. And sometimes he claimed he was Satan, and he certainly was apocalyptic and had an eschatological worldview in which he thought a race war, which he called Helter Skelter, named for the Beatles song, would end the entire current era. He had a sort of Kali Yuga idea, though he didn't tend to use Indian terms. He wanted to be a rock star, and he quoted the Beatles constantly. He had a strange relationship with some of the men in the group, and there weren't many, because he mostly preferred girls, because he liked to have sex with them. He generally didn't have sex with the men, unlike Jones. His principal sidekick was a guy called Bobby Beausoleil, who killed Gary Hinman, the first of the Manson murders. And he was actually a sort of minor celebrity drifter, very, very handsome, who'd taken part in a film, one of these so-called satanic films of Kenneth Anger, which also starred Mick Jagger, which was called Invocation of My Demon Brother. So Manson's general use of control was sex and drugs, mostly in ritualized contexts and mostly in mass contexts. So what most people would call group sex, or judgmental people would call orgies, I suppose. And he also used to isolate them, and the place where they're mostly associated with is a thing called Spahn Ranch, which actually was a disused dude ranch which had been a movie set, and no one actually lived in it. The point is, though, that like Jones not being on the radar for violence, before the murders, Manson was generally seen as a liberated and liberal figure, a hippie. He liked playing guitar and singing, and he was generally affirmative. And even the women, whom a lot of people now would say he exploited and treated badly, actually found him empowering, because he said, well, why do you have to do anything that the middle class wants you to do? You can have sex with whoever you feel like, you can drop out of college, you don't need to get married if you don't want, you don't have to have children, you can do anything you like. Essentially, you can live the same sort of life with the same sorts of freedoms as a man, which was quite revolutionary for girls in the 60s. Okay, just quickly through the novels. The first, Lazar's Sway, is actually written rather like it is going to be a film or a television series, as a set of vignettes that are all about the 1960s, really. It's not only about Manson. And it's got a loss of innocence narrative. Everything started off positively, things went wrong, drugs, violence, revolution, murder, war, etc. happened. Manson is actually a character glimpsed on the edge of the novel. And the most important parts of the novel that he is part of are conversations with Bobby Beausoleil, in which he explains his philosophy, so you can sort of see how it all fits together. And basically the novel argues that the flower children, who were all about peace, love and freedom, actually let loose a genie out of the bottle, a genie that was all about violence, essentially. And of course that meant that they had to pay at the end. That's why everything turned out so badly. The second novel is probably the most literarily celebrated and has the best reviews, and is the one I like the most and think is of the greatest value. So if anyone does want to read one, I'd start with Emma Cline's The Girls. The interesting thing about it is it's about a 14-year-old dropout, so maybe Diane, the woman I talked about earlier who joined at 14, is a little bit of a model for the character of Evie Boyd. But the most interesting thing about the story is that Manson, again, is glimpsed on the edge. Evie does have sex with him, and she does take drugs in controlled contexts that's directed by him. But what she finds attractive is the girls, the liberated life that they're leading, the fact that they have no interest in convention, that they're scornful about going to school and college and all the things that her parents care about. She wants to be free, like the girls. And the interesting thing is the novel turns on the fact that Suzanne, the girl she likes the most, who is a thinly disguised version of Sьюзан Atkins, the most violent of the killers and the one whom Manson was closest to, allegedly, the way the plot works, she's thrown out of the car on the night the murders are going to happen. And the second part of the story is Evie as an old woman in her 50s, wondering if Suzanne wanted to save her, if Suzanne didn't want her to end up in prison like they would for killing. And it's very interesting. The most interesting thing about the girls is that Klein suggests actually that the women of the Manson family were not simply bewitched by him, they were motivated by anger and fury about the generally oppressed position of women in society, which meant that when they were given an outlet, of course, their brains somewhat scrambled by drugs, they were incredibly excited and even willing to kill. When we get to Jonestown, the novels are not so exciting. This one is better than Woolett's, I think. Fred d'Agüiyara grew up in Guyana, and so even though he's not drawing on his own memories, he writes a novel which is about another forgotten group, which is, of course, the children that I mentioned to you, the 300 people under the age of 17 who died on the 18th November in Guyana in the jungle. And his focal pair are a little girl called Trina and her mother, Joyce, who used to be one of Jones's lovers, but now lives in terror and fear of him and hopes desperately that she'll be able to save her daughter. And it says, I mean, the best quote there I got, that's actually from a New York Times article, Julia Shears. Jonestown's youth were never identified. Their bodies lay in the jungle sun for too many days, obliterating their physical features. Their dental records were scarce. Their parents died with them. A majority of Jonestown's youths are buried in a mass grave in a cemetery in Oakland, California. The infants were interred 2 to a coffin. On the grand scale of human tragedies, Jonestown's children have become but a blip. That's a horrible thing to think, really. Okay, well, I'm not going to talk much about Woolett because I mentioned earlier I reviewed the book. I don't think it's that great. The most obvious problem with it is that she's changed some of the names but kept all of the facts. So Kärolyn Leyton is called Evelyn Linden. Does that really matter? Marceline Jones is called Rosaline Jones, but we all know the name of Jim Jones's wife, so what's the point? And interestingly, even though it's not a major theme, Kärolyn Leyton's character, Evelyn Linden, the heroine of this, the beautiful revolutionary, is also fueled by something of the anger that Klein attributes to the Manson girls. She has no outlet for her strong, capable managerialism in the 1960s. Everyone just assumes you're going to get married and have children and amount to nothing. And of course, she gets married but gets divorced, does have one child to Jim Jones, ends up murdering him and bringing about the death of 900 other people. Well, that's not nothing, I suppose. Okay. I'm going to move ahead because... damn. I want to go back one. There we are. No. This paper is too long, so I'm not going to do that long one about social construction of reality. We've already heard about Peter Berger today, and I think most of you will know how he is relevant. So I've said at the beginning that these 2 particular incidents really have wedged in the popular imagination. They're linked by seemingly senseless violence. They're linked by sexually voracious charismatic leaders, theology that is dominated by eschatology, and also the prominent role of women. But there are contrasts. Manson was a racist who hated black and Asian people, where Jones was an integrationist, and he and his wife, Marceline, actually adopted a number of Korean orphans after the Korean War. Both groups were anti-consumerist and opposed to mainstream values. They preferred a countercultural ethic of communalism and liberal values, even though we would now say that extreme control was exercised by both Manson and Jones. Both groups were perceived by the middle class and the establishment as extremely threatening. So why do people join these groups? At the time of Manson's trial, it was often said that he was insane. Nowadays we'd say he was a clever manipulator, and the tactics that he used are tactics that cause people to become tied to a particular human being by moving people to remote locations, denying them connections to their families, even telling them that they're completely liberated from anybody that they used to know is still a way of isolating people. But the people who knew him say, well, he was also funny, and he liked music, and he was impish and liked pranks and jokes, and it's quite obvious, I think, that a lot of people in the family didn't know that the murders were on the way. So when we think methodologically about this, I use a lot of different people, but one person I'm interested in is a legal academic called Cass Sunstein, who wrote a book in 2009 called On Rumours. And what it really is about is why people believe things that aren't true. And he says, you know, firstly, most of the stuff we know, we get second-hand. So it's easy to plant doubts in people's mind. Oh, you don't really know about that. Maybe this is really the truth. Maybe the earth is hollow or flat or whatever. After all, I have never seen the globe as such. Secondly, we have this thing called the social cascade. That's when we rely on what other people say if they're individuals that are part of our social group and like us and whom we want to trust and like. And it means that we're more likely to have confirmatory biases towards those sort of people, and we're more likely to distrust people who aren't like us. And the third thing is what he calls group polarization. So he says when like-minded people get together, actually they reinforce each other's beliefs, and they tend to become even more opposed to any other viewpoint, rather than becoming in any sense open-minded, which is one of the reasons why you can go online and find all sorts of amazing websites about how Hillary Clinton and various other people are all shape-changing lizards from outer space who run the world. There are a lot of people who seem to believe that. So let's just go to my final point, which is about the appeal of fiction. We've already heard about Pascal Boyer in the context of ufology, and most cognitive evolutionary biologists and psychologists suggest that humans have really unique capacities to create stories, narratives, and that what these are mostly directed towards is the survival of community. And of course, traditional religions have references to the power of language to shape the world. Adam giving names to the animals in Genesis, that kind of thing. And there's a vital element of narrative and story in the transmission of religion. Human beings are actually better equipped to understand novels and stories than they are to understand complicated analysis. There are evolutionary reasons, obviously. So novels and stories about, and television series about cults are more popular than scholarly analyses ever are going to be. And of course, a lot of the popular discourse is pretty ill-informed, and it's designed to appeal to an undiscriminating audience, that is, people generally who find these things titillating and exciting but actually object to them. So if you look at the novels that I've talked about very briefly today, they're all carefully researched, their authors are gifted stylists, and they've written very sophisticated stories, so they're not directed to the lowest common denominator. So I'd say we're entering a new era of very well-informed discussion in popular media of cults and new religions that used to be controversial in the recent past. I don't know if anyone's seen the Netflix documentary Wild Wild Country about Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh and his commune in Oregon, but it is another example. Fantastic film footage, very detailed, very interesting, strong narrative thread, so you get very involved in the characters, you really like it. So scholars of controversial religion and violence are also still concerned even with this higher level of information. And this is partly because they're aware that film and television as a medium have enormous power, and also there's a way in which detail and analysis gets lost in favor of a powerful storyline that emphasizes all the exotic stuff, the sex, the crime, the drugs, all the things that people are likely to find amazing. But is fiction really that powerful? Well, my answer is yes. We make sense of our world because we have an ability to recognize characters and we look for cues so we can guess their feelings and predict their actions. This is a thing that's called theory of mind in evolutionary psychology. And indeed, we bring theory of mind to operate even with people we've never met, people we read about in books. We try to think about them as psychologically, internally consistent. We can try to second guess their motivations. And if we can do that, entertainment, reading fiction, watching fiction, actually has the capacity to change our attitudes to life, as Charles Harvey says in the second point on that slide. And of course, that's really totally compatible with Berger's social construction of reality story, because he argues humans externalize certain ideas. That means they talk to each other about them. Then they objectivate them, so they say, well, these things are real, I didn't make them up, and now we all agree about them, so it's a thing that's out there behind us, beyond us, and it's real, and we're participating in it. And finally, then they re-internalize these ideas. And of course, stories, as I said earlier, are easier to remember than complicated analysis. I said there was an evolutionary reason for that, and that's because your memory works well with a story. But analysis of any kind, scientific, academic, presumes literacy and the preservation of writings so that people can consult them again later. And that's definitely a latecomer in human culture. And of course, my own feeling is that all religions at one point, at their beginning, were just narratives invented by human beings. So you have prophets receiving revelations, a community reinterpreting old ideas to suit new situations, or a creative artist deliberately making a new story to convey meaning about something, and so on. And so I leave you with images, the images that everybody's working with still. And there's a contrast there, and it's deliberate. Manson is presented in court, and later on in middle age, in a particularly insane television interview, and I use insane advisedly, that you can watch on YouTube. Whereas the two pictures I've given you of Jonestown are of the Joneses as an idyllic family, a good Christian group, Marceline Jones and her Korean adopted orphans, and the family standing outside Jim Jones's church in California. What people have done with these images is pretty amazing, and I don't see them coming to an end anytime soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, for a so thought-provoking presentation. Colleagues, yes, please.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation, really. And I have sort of something between a commentary and a question. So, well, the books you just mentioned are mostly, they're written by not famous writers. It's not quite pulp fiction, but, you know, it's kind of popular fiction. But, and what you said is very convincing, yes, this fictional reality wins, comparing to, you know, all those high-brow guys like us who are trying to study, you know, it and trying to then to write about it. But, you know, there is another case, I think very interesting, when a high-quality writer tries to write about the cult experience. And what comes to me now is that a novel by John Updike, S. It's an allusion to Scarlet Letter by Hawthorne. And there, actually, his narrative is based on Shirajnish, and it's a combination actually, and on Ramdas, the former Richard Alpert, who became a guru. And I found, when I read it, I found it very interesting. And, I think he explained to me certain things in a kind of sophisticated way, And actually, there was a lot about the role of women, because, as you remember, Rajneesh was surrounded by Amazons, kind of girls from Germany, by the way. So I think John Updike did a fine job. And I believe that it might stay with us, this fiction, about that cultic experience. And it's not worse than any kind of, scholarly work. So it's fiction, but done in a very good quality way. And so my question is that, and of course I understand that this kind of pulp fiction, is always much more popular, because I'm not sure that many people will read Updike, and they prefer something, like pulp things about cults. But still, I do believe that a fictional narrative, truth, of course, is a very relative thing nowadays. But I believe that high-quality fiction can bring to us this experience in a way not worse than the scholarly works do. Much it depends on quality. Much depends on quality. To my mind. What's your opinion?
Well, firstly, I'd agree with you about Updike. It's a great novel, but there's an important thing to point out, and I only became aware of this a little while ago, and it made me rather miserable. Novelists who were considered to be really very good, who won lots of awards, Updike is a good example, but also, for example, Saul Bellow, who also writes about religion in interesting ways. Mm-hmm. Henderson, The Rain King, for example, is a great novel about, I suppose, a certain kind of indigenous religion. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, what seems to be the case is that many of these highly popular but also highly award-winning, well-thought-of novelists are almost not read anymore. And there are several English novelists as well. For example, John Fowles, who also is interested in religion. 10 years after his death, there was only one of his novels that was still in print, and hardly any of them were selling. So I think that there is a change in terms of quick turnover in what is popular and what people want to read. And in fact, a lot of literature that was considered classic when I was in my last year of school, which I'm horrified to reveal was 40 years ago, those people are not read by the students I have nowadays. They don't know anything about them, and they don't see why they should. So I think we've got a problem there. But the second thing is, of the 4 authors that I showcased, actually, Klein, Lazar, and Woolett are all very highly thought of. They're not pulp writers at all. They're award winners. Only d'Agüyara is not well known, but his novel most definitely is not popular or pulp. So they occupy an interesting space between classics and really kind of crude page turners filled with sex and violence, which are another kind of reading that some people might do that contain some material that we're talking about.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let's hope that at least John Updike and John Fowles won't be forgotten completely. Let's hope.
I certainly do hope. I like both of them immensely, and in fact, Fowles was tremendously significant for my own kind of intellectual development as much as anything else. But it seems no one is reading him now.
Yeah, there was a movie based on his novel, Magician, I think it was the novel. The Magus, yeah, the Latin name. But unfortunately,
it's a terrible film.
Terrible movie. That's what I wanted to say. Unfortunately, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Question is, do you know anything about the relations of Manson family to the Esalen Institute in California? For I've heard that they had very serious complications with the FBI after all these killings. And what could they have in common?
This is
except maybe LSD.
This is a fantastic question. I actually don't think that the Manson family had anything to do with Esalen, but it's worth pointing out that once Manson was actually apprehended and the trials began, there was, of course, a slew of writings about the Manson family that came out. The first was Ed Sanders' book, which was, I think it was just called The Family. It actually had to be recalled because in chapter 5, he made an entirely false set of allegations that Manson was deeply involved with another new religious movement, highly controversial, called the Process Church of the Final Judgment, which was founded by Mary Ann McLean and Robert de Grimston in London in 1964. They were both ex-Scientologists, and it worshipped Christ, Satan, Lucifer, and Yahweh as a four-person divinity. And they were very, kind of active in San Francisco at the same time as the family. Now, in fact, Manson wrote one short column for the Process newsletter, and there was no intimate relationship and indeed no crossover of doctrines or personnel or anything. But Sanders had picked up on this and thought, well, these guys are Satanists or sort of Satanists, and Manson seems to be a sort of Satanist, and they must be connected. Anyway, it resulted that Process were rich, and they sued, and Sanders' book had to be recalled and pulped. And if you buy an edition of it nowadays online, even though it looks like it's ancient and it must be the original thing, it will be the second edition, which has had all of the stuff about the Process Church taken out. The next person who wrote like that, and Esalen is in his book, is Maury Terry, a guy who wrote a book about the Son of Sam murders. And he argued that there was this hidden network of pedophile, women-murdering, rapists, Satanists all over the US, but mostly in California, who were all connected to each other and all knew each other, and that the convictions were all suppressed and the police let them go and the courts let them go, sort of a big conspiracy theory. And he throws Esalen into the mix, but it is because of the drugs, not because they have any kind of interests in common. So I think what you're getting there from Sanders and from Terry were tabloid journalists, hack writing, but coming absolutely from a middle class, and if not explicitly Christian, at least Christian-framed worldview in which these people were deviants, and as such that meant that they were all having sex with goats and barbecuing babies, and it just absolutely meant that you could connect them all in a kind of subterranean linkage of satanic activity. None of it is true. Perhaps that's a pity. It's a good story.
I wonder if there were some testimonial literature on the tragedies you were trying to analyze, and if there were some testimonies, were there any alternative types of narratives that were trying to work with testimonies? Because you said that the fictional narratives evidently romanticize and exoticize the events, but if we take just testimonies of the people survived, that would be quite other type of narrative.
That's actually a terrific question to ask, and I'll give the answer mostly in terms of Jonestown, because again, the scholars who work in the new religious movement field in this room will already know this. But Rebecca Moore, a distinguished scholar herself and the review editor of Nova Religio, who asked me to write a review of Woolett's novel, is in fact the younger sister of Carolyn Leyton and Annie Moore, the people who perished at Jonestown and who in fact were, well, Carolyn Leyton at least, the architect largely of the deaths of the 900. And she has dedicated a very large part of her scholarly career to researching Jonestown as a much richer phenomenon than just the tragic, violent end would allow. And of course, it's very difficult because for all of us who work in new religious movements, if we say anything nice about a new religious movement, all the anti-cult and counter-cult people come out and say, you are a cult apologist, and you are in the pay of the Moonies or whoever it is. And of course, it's not at all true. But it's very difficult to say nice things. And of course, the other problem is because her sister was one of the main murderers, in fact, both sisters, if you like, though the number of people Annie Moore killed was far fewer. There has been immense personal and aggressive criticism of her academic project all of her life. She runs a website which everyone here can look up if you want. It's called Alternative Considerations of Jonestown. And what it has on it is testimonies, as you say, people's anecdotal stories, people's memories, photographs that other members, people who didn't actually die, because as I mentioned, there were between 5,000 and 7,000 members in about 1975, and 3 years later, only, I mean, we say only, 900. It was the largest number of intentionally dead Americans prior to September 11, but still there were many who were alive elsewhere and had to bear the shock of what had happened. And so that's a fantastic and very, very interesting resource, and it tries to destabilize the narrative that this act of violence is the definitive thing that you can know about Jim Jones and People's Temple. And Alternative Considerations of Jonestown says, no, there's a lot more that we can know. In the case of Manson, the family was much smaller, the structure was a lot looser, and all of the people who were actually intimately connected to him, the 6 women, the 2 men, actually went to prison in some way, except for Linda Kasabien, who turned her evidence over in return for indemnity. So there was virtually no one left to memorialize Manson in the same kind of way. His structure was much less stable. It had been in existence probably only about 14 months at the time of the murders. So it's not like Jones, who had 25 years of organizing a large church with a lot of people who had benefited and who had a different way of seeing what happened.
Thank you, Carol. It's really fascinating, and of course I share your approach. I think it's interesting when now in the discussion that I think there are probably 4 genres, different genres developing, maybe 5 genres developing around new religious movements. The academic studies, us, the fiction that you spoke about, the testimonials or the autobiographical writings here, which are very interesting. And you mentioned, we can mention also, what's her name, Claire Prophet's daughter, Erin Prophet, who, by the way, it's interesting, she's also a scholar of religious studies, and that's an interesting, but a very, very interesting book. And the documentaries. You mentioned Wild Wild Country. Now there's the 3-part series documentary about Jonestown, which is interesting, and I'm sure there are much more. So it's interesting how much this phenomena, varied phenomena, how many different types of I don't know how to call them exactly, literature or media that they create. I think that while there are differences in, I don't know, qualities, like literary quality, accuracy, I think for us, and that I think you did very well, I think our role as scholars is to analyze all of them, look what stands, what are the culture, trends, ways of reading. I think even the more accurate, like Wild Wild Country, which I think is a wonderful series, and Prophet's work, we have to see what do they emphasize, what do they show, what do they interpret. And I think many of the things that you mentioned, like the emphasis of the role of women, again, these are things that we can see now that are coming together. I think there are other questions that they come. So I think for us, excellent material for analysis, which I think is no less important than the movements themselves that we study. So thank you again for your lecture.
Thank you so much, Boaz. In fact, you've just made me think of something which I should mention because it's really crucial. A lot of this material is appearing because the internet has stopped the legal control of the material. And this happens most clearly with the Church of Scientology. Until the year 2009, the Church of Scientology was able to control via a complicated system of legal actions, mostly to do with copyright law, but also with libel and defamation. They were able to control what ex-members could write and what people could write about them, and they persecuted scholars who wrote things that they didn't like. And some of the best writing about Scientology, I think, of course, of the late Roy Wallace's The Road to Total Freedom, was actually shown to the leadership of the church and given an all clear before he published it, because he didn't want to be in trouble with them. But in 2009, Anonymous began Project Chainology, essentially a large-scale internet harassment project against the Church of Scientology, which was accompanied by real-world protests where everyone wore a V for Vendetta mask and, you know, sang Never Going to Give You Up by Rick Astley outside Church of Scientology offices. And of course, what they kept doing, of course, which was their principal thing, because Anonymous are basically an electronic frontiers abolition organization dedicated to the free distribution of material, was every time Scientology tried to take something down, they'd repost it on 1,000 other sites. And it's interesting to note that after that, all of the Scientology memoirs that we all know, as well as Lawrence Wright's book and the film that Louis Theroux made, My Scientology Movie, which is very interesting to look at as well, they all came out because basically the free posting of information has kind of killed copyright law. There are still people who try to use it, but it doesn't really work very well. And that means also that a lot of people from movements who were reluctant to speak on camera or to be interviewed or even to offer any kind of personal testimony, because there were injunctions, especially about those movements that had rich and powerful people in them, all that's collapsed as well. So I find this very interesting. In Australia, we only have a few really famous cults or new religious movements, and I spend a lot of time working on almost all of them. And it's just in the last year or so that there's been a documentary made about the group that Anne Hamilton Byrne led called The Family. They were immensely powerful, and in fact, the person who still pays her hospital bills and tries to run legal cases is the son of one of our former Governor-Generals. The Governor-General in Australia is the direct representative of the Queen of England and theoretically the highest possible authority in the country. And it was this connection with very powerful people that meant that Hamilton Byrne and her group flew under the radar for 30 years, really, before anybody had any idea of what they were doing. And the other two groups, I guess, that are really well known, the Brotherhood that lived in Western Australia, a PhD thesis has finally been completed on that by an ex-member. And Kenja, the movement that was led by Ken Dyers, who shot himself in 2007 when about another 3 or 4 girls accused him of having raped them when they were underage. He'd already got out of a number of legal cases, but he realised when these particular people made the accusations, his time was up. So yeah, we're actually, it's a great time to be interested in contemporary or new religion, because the legal frameworks in a lot of Western countries are breaking up because of different modes of communication and different expectations. And so we have a lot more material to work with, and it's an exciting time.
The bad news, of course, is that the European Union is just passing legislation to stop all this nice freedom of the internet. Now, I was wondering whether there's room for a general theory of novels about shocking events. The ones you've been talking about, I'm also thinking about novels about terrorism. And now we have novels about people joining the Islamic State and things like that. And I remember on one article about novels about terrorism saying that people tended to read them to try to understand terrorism. But of course, this was not going to be very useful unless the authors had some first-hand knowledge of terrorism, which invariably they didn't. So, I mean, in this general theory, the novelist has to try and make the apparently inexplicable comprehensible, and they then have to make it comprehensible in terms that make sense for the audience, their audience, which isn't necessarily going to have anything to do with what actually went on.
That's a fabulous point, and I thank you for it, Mark. It's the real problem, I think, about what we think fiction is supposed to do. And I think that we think fiction is supposed to deepen understanding. That if you read a good novel about relationships or about the grieving process or about, settling the Americas in the 16th century, that it's supposed to give us some kind of understanding of what happened when those things were happening. But this opens up a question. Novels about terrorism, I've read a few. In fact, at the risk of sounding like a very peculiar person, one of my principal interests, apart from directly religious subjects, is lone wolf terrorism. And my favourite case is Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, whom I've spent years studying and reading his manifesto, etc. And I find it really, really fascinating. Partly because it's a kind of it's an initial point for eco-terrorism, which is beginning to become quite significant now, I think. Okay. I'm not sure that anybody really understands terrorism. And this is one of the problems. You mentioned earlier today that some things are perhaps not religious, but they might be a human experience that's kind of subterranean to religion. Religion gets built over the top of it or something like that. A lot of the old-fashioned sociological theories, deprivation and so on and so forth, actually have a kind of weird resonance in the case of a lot of people who have been attracted, say, to joining Islamic State. And perhaps even they have a weird relevance for white supremacist forms of terrorism as well, because there seems to be this intense paranoia amongst white men especially, that they're somehow being outnumbered, outbred, taken over, etc., etc. And I think, of course, because my own country has been completely rattled by the mosque shootings in Christchurch in New Zealand, our nearest neighbour, a country which affectionately, or perhaps not so affectionately, refers to us as the Western Isles, where we refer to it as the Eastern Isles, and many people think that the two countries should join. And of course, the shooter in the Christchurch killings was an Australian. And I think I'll take a leaf from Jacinda Ardern, with whom I am more than slightly in love, and say that I will not name him. We should not give to any enactor of this kind of hatred any recognition whatsoever. But I think there is a strong deprivation narrative for most of our 21st century terrorists, which perhaps there wasn't for somebody like the Unabomber. And actually, speaking as, this is not a good thing to end on, but because Mark raised this whole idea about having first-hand knowledge of terrorism, even the people who run the programs like Prevent in England and the Australian equivalent of it, the programs don't work at all. In fact, a couple of the boys who have done acts of terror in Australia had just been through de-radicalisation programs and basically got certificates saying they'd got 90% and they were completely de-radicalised. And the first thing that they did when they were let out of custody from whichever institution they were in was go and bomb a mosque or shoot a few imams. So really, if they were Muslims, bomb a synagogue or shoot a few Christians. So in fact, these programs don't work. So I mean, I don't know what we're going to do about it. I think the eternal fascination is we don't know what makes people behave like that, and we don't really know how to make people's minds change. Though, speaking in the literature of Nerms, there is at least one fantastic book. That guy who was in The Covenant, the Sword and the Arm of the Lord, I've forgotten his name, and he's written a book called Temple of Hatred, which is about completely de-radicalising, having been an armaments stocker, someone who was looking towards an end-time scenario, becoming completely Kerry Noble is his name. He became completely disillusioned with the minister who led the extremist white supremacist Christian identity group that he was part of, and eventually he left and he's become a negotiator with potentially violent standoffs and things like that. It's a terrific book because it's a human story of how one person changed his mind. But I don't know how anyone can force anyone to change their mind. It's one of the reasons why brainwashing didn't work, really, because you can't force people to change their minds. So I'm afraid getting 90% in a de-radicalisation program probably isn't going to change your mind either.
Okay, thank you so much, Susan, for your so inspiring, I would say, talk, really inspiring. And